Good afternoon. I'm Karina Rautenstein. I'm the programmer for the TIFF Industry Conference, and welcome to Pathways and Protocols Collaborating with Indigenous Communities. Today's session is part of the Dialogues program, and we'd like to thank the OMDC for their support. This session is also presented in collaboration with imagineNATIVE Film and Media Arts Festival, so thank you to them. I'd like to also acknowledge the Mississaugas of New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat for hosting us here today and for hosting TIFF year-round. Just a reminder, there is no photography or video recording, but these sessions are live streamed to TIFF Live, that channel on YouTube, so please share it with your friends after today's session, and hello to all the folks watching right now. And please also feel free to tweet. We do encourage that here at the industry conference. We've got many films playing at TIFF 2016 from Indigenous filmmakers, and we really like to highlight them right now and encourage you all to support their films this week. From New Zealand, we've got Lee Tamahori with The Patriarch. From Australia, Ivan Sen with Goldstone. We've got, of course, Alaniso Bomswin with We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice. Zacharias Kunuk, Malig Lutit. And we've got Amanda Chanel with Sammy Blood from Sweden. We've got many films from also featured in the Shortcuts program, so we do encourage you to please support these films this week. Today's session was inspired by Screen Australia's comprehensive guide, Pathways and Protocols, A Filmmaker's Guide to Working with Indigenous People, Culture, and Concepts by Terri Janke. Now, both New Zealand Film and Screen Australia's Indigenous branch have been industry models for successfully bridging the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous film communities. And in Canada, this conversation is long overdue. So let's get started. Today's discussion is chaired by Jason Ryle, the Artistic Director of imagineNATIVE Media Arts Festival, and I'd like to welcome our guests and Jason to the stage. First up is Jesse Huente, Director of Film Programs at TIFF Bell Lightbox. Zacharias Kunuk, Director-Producer of Maliglutit Searchers. Jonathan Franz, Producer, Director of Photography of Maliglutit Searchers. Ian Ludwig, Writer, Director, Producer from Northern Queensland, Australia. Welcome. Jasmine McSweeney, Head of Marketing at New Zealand Film Commission. And of course, our chair, Jason Ryle. There he goes. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Karina, and thank you all for joining us today. We're sure going to be a short but very lively discussion. This is a topic that a lot of us in the community, in the industry, have been speaking about. So I'm really excited and grateful for all of you to take the time today to spend on this and to explore, I think, from broad strokes and try to get down to some best practices, maybe from your own experiences, on how we can better collaborate with Indigenous communities. And Jesse, I'd like to start with you, if I may. I think of Neil Diamond's incredible documentary, Real Engine, and I'd like to use this as a starting point. You were in this film, and really want you to set up, if you could, just from your own words, in terms of what are the issues at hand, what are we talking about, why is it important to actually sort of explore this topic of better collaboration?
Well, I think if I was to use Real Engine as a jumping point, I'd say two things. I would say, Real Engine was a film about the history of Indigenous people in cinema, which is a largely unpleasant history, and I think that's when we talk about making movies now, we have to go in acknowledging that is the history that we're confronting, especially in North America, but certainly for Indigenous people all over the world, and so that that should ultimately inform a lot of the things around the movies we make. We can't divorce ourselves from that history, so I think we have to go in with eyes open. I would say the other thing that I'm probably most proud about my involvement with Real Engine was that all of the on-screen experts in Real Engine were Indigenous. And so you had Indigenous people talking about their own history, mostly represented by other people on screen. And I think if there's another thing to take away from Real Engine, it's that was a very purposeful decision to have Indigenous people be the voice for that movie. And I think that's why that movie ultimately worked so well. And I think if you look at the Indigenous movies that have worked, are, you know, the real top of the peak, they're all made very much, if not entirely by, but certainly with full cooperation from Indigenous people. And I think those are the two things I would say. And a lot of the movies that are in Real Engine that we're talking about are the exact opposite. And that's why they're the subject of that documentary and not of that documentary.
Are you willing to name some names of the films that got it right? I mean, these films that you just mentioned?
Well, Zach's made a lot of great movies that get it awfully right, including the one premiering tonight. I mean, Alanis. But I think even if we look at Australia with films like 10 Canoes, or, you know, movies where you have a real deep collaboration between a non-Indigenous filmmaker and an Indigenous filmmaker that do get it right. But I think it's also because those, you know, films, those filmmakers, those artists approached with inclusion being the key part of the whole process, and realizing that you couldn't actually make those movies without.
Right.
And I think that's, you know, we're still seeing that as a problem, where our stories appear on screen without us being involved in a decision-making way on those titles. And I think that's the history that Real Engine was about, and that's the history we still have to overcome as we forge ahead trying to make these movies.
Great. That's a good segue to Ian. Karina mentioned the Pathways and Protocols document that Screen Australia, the Indigenous branch, uses. And I know, Ian, as a producer based in Australia, I'd like you to speak in terms of what this document has meant for the industry broadly, and also what the document has meant to you as a producer, as a film storyteller.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. The Indigenous Protocols document we developed in Australia by Terri Janke. She's an Indigenous lawyer. That document sets out the protocols, the way that we communicate and the way we work with our Indigenous communities. So it's not a rigid document, but it gives us a framework where we can apply it in the different communities, because Australia's a continent, and it's made up of many different countries, of many different tribal lands. So the one document couldn't be made just to fit the one clan. So it really is a working document that provides guidance and allows non-Indigenous filmmakers to find the correct path to developing, like through pre-production and all that stuff, development and filming. But it's also for Indigenous companies working with other Indigenous companies, from, say, my company and, brothers here. So if we wanted to collaborate from Australia and work with them, we'd have to, also collaborate with them through this document to say, I know you guys don't have one here, America or Canada, but there is one they created that we can show you, and we could say, this is what we do in Australia, and if we were going to co-write or co-produce with you fellas, we'd want to do the same protocols in your country.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a really important point you make, Ian, is that a protocols document, like Protocols and Pathways, or any kind of protocol document that's established in Canada or elsewhere, is just as valuable to Indigenous filmmakers and communities as well. I'm not Inuk, so I'm not exactly sure what the protocols could be for an Inuit community, for example. So I think it's a vital point that needs to be made in terms of when speaking about any kind of protocols development related to this. It keeps in mind it's a protocol and a framework for everyone to use. So in Australia, correct me if I'm wrong here, so with the Indigenous branch at Screen Australia, when a project comes into the doors, if there is any mention, however tangential, about anything Indigenous culture, Indigenous imagery, or a plan to shoot on Indigenous territory, it gets sent to the Indigenous branch at Screen Oz, who then works with the producers to make sure what?
Penny Smollicom and Andrew Dillon at the Screen Australia's Indigenous branch, they field probably about 10 or 20 calls per week, you know, from people wanting to work with Indigenous. And they've come in the wrong way. They've come in with maybe a script already written, you know, and you're kind of going, well, hang on, how did you write that script? Where did you get the knowledge from? And how do you know that that's going to be appropriate, you know, culturally correct? So it's kind of like, unless you have an Indigenous writer who's been working with you, you know, we don't really want to know about this because you haven't really taken the proper pathways and protocols. But if one does come through and Penny and they look at it and they go, hey, you know what, these guys are really, really sincere and they've done the right thing and they're actually following the right pathways and protocols, then we'll get a call from them, from either Screen Australia or Screen Queensland, and they'll say, hey, look, Ian or Richard or one of the other guys, you know, we'd like you to meet and talk with this producer who's interested in doing something with, you know, with one of the Aboriginal stories.
So from your own experience working within the document, I know you're very familiar with it. So if you can take us through, for example, maybe one of your own ideas if you've had. So if you have an idea of a story you'd like to tell, what's the process? What's your first step in terms of seeing if you actually are able to make this story?
Yeah, go and ask permission. And if they say no, well, that's it. Yeah.
Well, I guess ask permission from whom? I mean, I think that's always one of the biggest questions that we get is how do we seek permission? How do we find it? What are the channels?
Yeah, well, if you're going to make a story in an Indigenous community in Australia, well, especially up in the Cape, I'm from Cape York, why? You know, what's your interest? You know, what's your agenda in it? Why do you, you know, I wouldn't want to go and make a story about Ned Kelly, who's a bushranger in Australia. Leave that to the white fellas, but, you know, you know, that's the kind of thing that first thing I would think about, I think, why are you interested in that story? You know, is it something you've read in a newspaper when you were in New Zealand and all of a sudden you want to come over and give us a hand or something? Or, you know, it's, yeah, that's probably the first thing. But, and then if it's a legitimate reason, going to the people, asking for permission, telling them what's involved. You have to be very, very clear. You know, you have to be very, very open and transparent. If you try and hide anything, you know, our mob, they can sniff out a bullshitter. Easy. You know?
So you've had lots of experience with these things. So there have been times, clearly, I know we've spoken about this as well, where if permission isn't given, is it a matter of just stopping dead in your tracks? You don't have the permission to tell the story, or is it, can we adapt it somehow? I mean, have there been both cases?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I didn't have to put this to, the last one I made was a songlines that won a gold award at the Atlanta Documentary Film Festival. And it's a story about two brothers who came from the north, and they brought the good and bad. They brought the law with them to this community. And the last songman, the last lawman, is in his 60s. I mean, that's not very old, but in Indigenous communities, that's like, you know, you're almost one leg in the grave. So you know, just putting it to David and saying, brother, you're the last one left. If you die, you know, what happens to all that culture? What happens to that language? You know, those songs, it's gone. So I didn't have to put it to him that way because he was already keen already, but that just reinforced it for him. Like when we got on set and we did filming and we did interviews and maybe it's a bit long and it's 14 hours of footage that we've got and we're doing recreations and things can get a little bit emotional and stuff like that. But, you know, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, don't just stop and go, okay, that's it, I'm going to go home. You know, you said no. Yeah, you know, try and talk. I mean, Jesse's talking about 10 canoes and that there, Rolf de Heer. There's a great example of how a white person can work with David Gulpilil at TO and just turn out 10 canoes, Charlie's Country, The Tracker. You know, those films were great because of that collaboration.
So what was that collaboration? Like, what did Rolf do?
Well, Rolf didn't just, he wasn't a fly-by-night filmmaker. He actually lived with David. He went on country. He stayed with him. I think David was in jail one part, and Rolf would visit him, and they'd sit down and they'd write, and David would give him some dialogue and stuff.
David Gopalil, the
Yeah, and it got to the point where David actually took Rolf on the country and showed him where he was born, and showed him where his father died. So it's like Rolf is David, and David's Rolf.
Now, I know a lot of Indigenous producers, filmmakers here, Indigenous people as well, I would say, can often look to places like Australia and New Zealand with a bit of a utopic lens, particularly when it comes to filmmaking and production. And Ian, I just want to have another question for you, and we'll move on to Jasmine. In regards to the pathways and protocols at Screen Australia, is that across the board? I mean, is it only Screen Oz funded works? Are there regional agencies that also have protocols? Do broadcasters have protocols?
Look, I'm from Queensland, so I'm only aware in our state, we have an Indigenous department in Screen Queensland, Belinda Miller. So from Screen Oz, we go to Screen Queensland, we have another Indigenous department there. But Canberra, maybe other places, maybe they don't. But I know, and they wouldn't, I don't know what happens when it comes to the Indigenous stories in those states, but the state that I'm from, Queensland, yeah, definitely we enforce those protocols there. And the other thing too is that Queensland has a really, really huge Indigenous population. You know, we're the second largest one in Australia. It's WA and us, but sorry, New South Wales. And so yeah, we have a great working relationship with our regional body, but you know, I can't talk for the other ones, and I'm not too sure because I've never filmed in their other states, but they could have.
Right. And Jasmine, the New Zealand Film Commission doesn't have an Indigenous branch, but has an incredible history of turning out commercially, artistically, culturally significant films. I mean, right from Once Were Warriors to Taika Waititi's films, Tammy Davis, Tusi Tamasisi. And I think for such a small country with a population less than the population of Toronto, I mean, I'm always fascinated by what your secret formula is. So can you speak to that?
Well, there is no secret formula. It's strong storytelling, so we don't have an Indigenous department like Screen Australia. So the scripts are considered alongside everybody else's scripts. And they're great storytellers, and they've got great stories to tell and a great perspective.
And one of the things too, I mean, I think one of the stats that has astounded me, and I heard it again yesterday, so it clearly still astounds others, is, and correct me if I'm wrong with this, but most of the top 10 or 8 of the top 20 domestic feature films. 12 of the top 20 domestic feature, top grossing domestic, are Indigenous.
And Hunt for the Wilderpeople is currently in release in New Zealand, and it's 12.7 million.
Yeah. I mean, this is incredible.
Yeah.
So with an Indigenous population, roughly 15-20%, clearly there's a non-Indigenous audience that comes and sees this work.
Yeah, 23% of New Zealand population is Māori. 90% of New Zealanders have said they have seen Boy, and we are expecting the same result to be for Hunt for the Wilderpeople. But in Australia, the film's been released there too, and it's reached 11 million. Hunt for the Wilderpeople.
It's extraordinary, and you credit this to story.
Story.
Absolutely. And so what is the outcome of that story on screen? Because clearly, I mean, showing contemporary works like Hunt for the Wilderpeople or Boy or The Orator, I mean, these films have been hugely successful. So what's the impact on the New Zealand culture?
It's an interesting question. When we look at when we look at Hunt for the Wilderpeople, you're actually looking at contemporary New Zealand. And I was thinking about this question yesterday because it's a Māori woman. Have you seen Hunt for the Wilderpeople? Yeah. It's a Māori woman married to a Pākehā man, a young Māori boy in the bush with a older Pākehā gentleman. The social worker is Māori. The policeman is Māori. But that's New Zealand that we live in. And it just sits there and everybody is very comfortable with it. And nobody thinks that anybody is stereotyped or cliched. That is what New Zealand is like. And then when you look at a film like The Patriarch, where you have the owner of the farm is a Pākehā, and the sharers are Māori, the two Māori families. That film accurately represents what New Zealand was back then. So when we sit down as Kiwis and we watch Hunt for the Wilder People, we see ourselves.
But there was also a starting point to this. I mean, looking back in terms of where was that starting point? We had a great conversation with Lee Tamahori, who did The Patriarch and Once Were Warriors last night, and I know there's something very interesting I found about the actual presentation and permissions that you give for Once Were Warriors.
So Once Were Warriors is a very special film to New Zealanders, and we love it. We get a lot of requests to screen that film overseas, and before that film screens and before we agree for that film to screen, we have something that has to be read out which explains that this is a story about a Māori family. It is not a documentary about how Māori live. And it's very important to us that people understand that these are actors, and he has told a story, as in if you would see, what was the Australian film, Animal thing? It's just a story about a family who happen to be Māori.
And for those who haven't seen the film, it deals with very hard subject matter. Yeah, absolutely.
Jason,
yeah.
can I just jump in? It strikes me though, as someone I've been to New Zealand, and it strikes me that there the cultural institutions have a much deeper engagement with the Indigenous people there.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that perhaps that is they are a reflection of the colonial experience there, much like our cultural institutions are a presentation of our colonial experience, and why, and perhaps I would guess similar for Australia, which might be why Australia has to have a Indigenous branch, New Zealand doesn't, and Canada does not, but may require one, because again, I think I think the institutions just approach this radically differently. So I think the equity that New Zealand film is able to do is simply not reflected without Indigenous specific funding at most other countries, and I think that's unique in many ways to New Zealand.
Yeah.
That's a very good point.
So Māoridom is quite integrated into our society. There is a documentary that's screening in New Zealand at the moment called Puie, The Story of Our Song. It's a Māori song. It was written in the 70s, and it was number one in the hit parade for many weeks. Taika Waititi is in the film, and he actually talks about the fact that when we were growing up, because we were around the same age, that wasn't cool to be Māori, and people would poke fun of you, and they would call us names and throw stones at us. But now everybody wants to be Māori, and it's the coolest thing on earth. And sometimes people tell you they're Māori, and you do look at them, and you think,
Yeah, right.
So I want to boil down further, building off of Jesse's point and everything you've said so far. So when a project comes into the commission, I mean, there's still that level of consultation.
Absolutely, and we're very like what Ian was talking about. So, for example, last year a film screened here called The Deadlands. It was directed by Tor Fraser. He's Fijian. The producers were Pākehā. The writer is Pākehā, though he does have some Māori.
Which is non-Indigenous.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
And it's in Te Reo. So we have advisors who work with the writers and the producers very closely in the writing of the script and in the development of the script. And we also have iwi advisors on set, keeping an eye on the kaupapa of the film, which is, kaupapa to us is the representation of all things Māori in a respectful and honourable way.
And I know Taika Waititi with Thor 3, he's directing Thor 3 currently. And can you speak about the opening that he had there, or relate that to?
Ian probably so, and for Thor he had, so what happens in New Zealand is if we do anything, we always like to honour the people of the land, and we will do a haka, as you will have seen before our rugby, and we will have a ceremony, and it's no matter how many times you see it's a very emotional experience for all New Zealanders. So when Taika went to Australia, and before Thor started, to honour the people of the land, I cannot remember the name of the iwi that came down, and they did a traditional welcome, and did what we call, which is very important in New Zealand, is they blessed the event, and they say it's okay for you to be here.
And I know Peter Jackson did the same thing with The Lord of the Rings and swears that it helped the production, so just table that as well. Let's move on to Zacharias and Jonathan, whose incredible film Malaglutit, Searchers, is playing here at TIFF. I'd like to start by playing, we have a clip from the film, 4.5 minutes. We have a courtesy monitor here for everyone on stage. Now, Malaglutit has its world premiere tonight, I believe, Jonathan, which is very exciting, so you should definitely see it. It's a phenomenal film. Zach, I'm going to ask you a question now. I mean, this is an incredible film. I love this. It's a beautiful reimagining of the Ford classic, The Searchers. It also really exists firmly in the continuum of your films that really started in the 1980s. And I've heard you before tell a story about when television first came to Igloolik. Can you share that story with us again and just talk about the inspiration, what it meant to you, and that led you to tell your stories?
Our community, Igloolik, was the last community to get TV signal up in the Arctic because in '75 we voted, majority of the people didn't want it. So again, we tried again in '79 and they still didn't want it because there was nothing in Inuktitut on the airwaves. In the 80s, when Inuit broadcasting started, there was a little bit of Inuktitut broadcasting. So our community gave in to TV in 1983. I remember it very well. It was fall when they switched the channel on and we watched the first hockey game. Yeah, so we didn't want it because there was nothing about us in it. And so from then on, we went to work. Being the last community, and we went to work. We tried to put a lot of our elder stories on TV, and we wanted to do feature film. We wanted to be in par with the rest of the world as we started learning this new technology, and it's just getting better and better. And these days we can now shoot without any moving parts in the camera. It's the beauty of the technology. So we try to use this technology for good, and we could use it for bad, but we want to use it for good to save our culture, save our language. Just imagining in 100 years from now, we're not going to be here, so our films will be here. So we try to do it right. We have elders as our art directors that do our sets right. And we have hunters that build sets, cutting igloo blocks, building the set, and doing it right. So we try to capture it right now. Because when we started watching TV about us, they were doing it all wrong. They turned our sea oil lamp the other way around, because when you look from the door, the sea oil lamp is facing that way. Maybe the director wanted to see it the other way so it looked good on the camera. So we started noticing all these little things that are not right, so we've been trying to do it right.
So, I mean, what's incredible about your productions, and certainly really came to light, I think, to larger public consciousness with Atarnajuat, which still to this day is the watershed in Canadian Indigenous cinema and international Indigenous cinema, is how, like, the depth of Inuit participation in the crew, to the recreation and the revitalization of old tool making, for instance. Can you speak about that in terms of how, and that's through every production that you have, it's Inuit are embedded in the crew?
In our little community of Igloolik, I remember when we did Atanakjut, we put the whole community to work. We had, because we're still lucky, because we have our elders who can stitch clothes, because in some part of the Arctic they don't know how to do it anymore. But we're very lucky still that people who, it's amazing to watch when you have an actor, you put it in front of these elders who are going to make the costume, and the way they measure the person by their hands and by strings, and it fits the costume. We still do that. They do that. They know how to do that. It sometimes fits perfectly. yeah, that's how we do it. We put the community to work, like elders making clothes with young ladies, apprentices, learning how to do it. And we have igloo builders, igloo builder masters with young people helping them learning. So we're trying to teach at the same time. And at the start, I started to notice, because we've been colonized, we've been Christianized, and everybody has what do you call it? The Haluna names. Like Charlie and Bob.
Christian names, yeah.
In these films, I started realizing, hey, they're using this. We put old costumes on them and says, "Hi, Charlie, can I have that?" So another thing, what we did was they have their government name, they have their Bible names, and then they have their Inuit names. And if we don't have a character name, we use their real Inuit name. And if they're on set, they only answer to their Inuit name. If you say Charlie, they won't even look at you. And when you say their Inuit name, they'll respond. So we make that up as we go, and it works.
That's amazing. Now, Jonathan, as a non-Inuit, non-Indigenous producer on this film productions, speak to that. Your bio says that you lived up in Inuit for 4 years and learned the Asuma production way. So can you speak to that and what that means?
Yeah, I mean, it's a process of just sort of checking your ego at the door. You know, I showed up 2012, hung out at the office, sort of waiting for an intro or anything more formal, and you're just kind of one of a bunch of people working together to try to get something done. And I remember asking Zach, so when are we going shooting, and how long are we going to be for, and where's my shot list, and what's happening? And he just looked and said, you're asking questions I can't answer. And it was sort of the first part of a long lesson of understanding there's this history of doing things. There's a hierarchy of a structure, decision making. There's a knowledge of the land that you can't explain, and I will never understand. So you just sort of go with the flow, and you be ready. When we're ready to go, we'll go. When we're ready to shoot, you shoot. When we're ready to go home, you go home. And that's sort of how it evolved, and a lot of listening. So I was there for 2 years until we started to put the searchers together and had built a bit of an understanding of how things work. Comfort with Zach, his style of directing and the types of shots he likes and how he edits and works, and just kind of join the legacy of 30 years of filmmaking was a big honor for me.
And I imagine too, it's primarily in Inuktitut as well, the production. So is the consultation, it's embedded in the production. Is that a fair way of saying that?
Yeah, I mean, everything, we have a script going into, even in the feature, but the script's kind of left on the side, and it's just a discussion, with, Zach and Natar and the actors and myself. It's a very, collaborative, spontaneous way of working. You can't predict the weather. You don't know, if a skidoo's going to break down and you've got to fix it, or you might camp in a different spot for various reasons. So it's always sort of a moving target. Maybe a third of what's in the final cut was never scripted. It's just stuff that happens. So you have a way of not fearing the unknown and kind of inviting an element of chaos and unpredictability to make some magical moments that you couldn't ever intend to shoot if you had tried.
And it shows. I mean, the film is extraordinary. It really is. I can't believe we're almost at Q&A time. Honestly, it's been really quickly. Jesse, I want to leave the final word to you in terms of this formal panel. So we hear a lot about the R word, reconciliation, a lot in Canada these days. So can you tie this all together? How important is all of this to, and I know you can, I mean, why is it important to us moving forward?
Reconciliation or movies? Movies and reconciliation?
Yes.
Yeah. Because movies helped get us here, is the reality. So, you know, for the better part of a century, cinema was a tool of colonialism to lie to all of us about the history of this place and the history of the people that come from this place. And those lies have helped put our people into continue the problems for our people. And so, but I'm a firm believer in that art is going to be a key for both all the communities in Canada to understand reconciliation and to understand each other. And so movies are, while they've been historically part of the problem, and quite frankly continue to be part of the problem, they can also be part of the solution. But the key thing to remember, certainly coming out of this panel, is the movies that were part of the problem were made without our participation. The movies that are the solution will not be made that same way. That is impossible. And unlike, this is no longer 1939, when, you know, it was much easier to make a Western with marauding Indians killing Western civilization because we were not in a position to protest. And those times are also over. So I don't think you can make a movie like the original Searchers now and expect that it's going to go over in the same way. So, you know, if you're genuine about wanting to participate in reconciliation through cinema in Canada, and I would say in the States, although they haven't gone through the same process, I mean, I think it's key to understand that your voice is probably not the key one. And so you're going to enter into a project where you have to give up that control, and that the funders and all the bodies have to make sure that the systems are in place to allow that to happen, and also to grow, you know, because there's going to be, and I can tell you already, Jason, you know this, I mean, you know, we have the sesquicentennial here in Canada coming up next year, which much of the nation will be celebrating. I won't be, and, you know, I don't think a lot of us will be that are on this stage. But there is an enormous opportunity in Canada right now, because there is more interest in Indigenous stories than there's ever been before, to understanding. I feel true willingness on the part of non-Indigenous people upon our government, despite the fact that they haven't necessarily lived up to any of their promises yet. But there's a sense of willingness there to reconcile. And so there's going to be this huge interest and opportunity to get these stories on screen. We have to make sure that Indigenous people are actually in control of that, because we cannot go through another generation of moving image lies about us on screen. And I firmly believe the only way to ensure that is to have Indigenous involvement. And so I would encourage all the funders and everyone that's interested in using art and cinema to help this country heal and reconcile, understand that we are not currently prepared to do this properly. We do not have the systems in place. The cultural institutions are not built to do this, quite the opposite, in fact. And so we have to encourage is probably a little, not exactly, a little too soft for me. We have to force them to include us in this conversation, and at the most senior levels of these productions. And it's not just a screenwriter or a co-producer that's checking a box for a funder. It's people in positions of decision-making authority that can guide these films and these stories appropriately to the screen, that can follow and set up the pathways and protocols that are needed to bring these stories to the screen, and to give the audience the genuine, authentic subjects and approach that is actually going to fuel reconciliation and not just further propagate what has got us here in the first place.
Very well said, Jesse. It's a great way to end the conversation. Now we have some time for questions and answers. There is volunteers here, so you can just please wait for the microphone to come to you.
Thank you. My name is Rodrigo. I'm a film commissioner based in Chile, in the Mapuche territories, actually. First of all, thank TIFF and thank imagineNATIVE, because this is a discussion that's been going on all over the world, and I'm very glad to see that there's a lot of people here present discussing this. This is a discussion that has to be opened. The whole industry has to be aware of what's going on. In our territories, we have Hollywood studios moving in. We have the horrible experience of Rapa Nui that totally destroyed the protocols in a small island. And now we have TV series from Fox coming in. They've already filmed without the consent of our ancestors. And now we have a large, major movie. One of the bigger producers of 300 is moving in for the story of Leftrado. Leftrado is one of the smartest and most greatest military strategists, Mapuche. And this is a concern for us because we don't want to, as film commissioners, we don't want to destroy the business, right? And I comply with my colleague where there is no formula. But how do we do and how do we accommodate Hollywood production where we include our recommendations and they actually respect our protocols and our recommendations? And we're talking about a country like Chile, which is one of the most developed economical countries, which widely accepts this type of production. So a big controversy here. Thank you.
Thanks.
I can answer that because in New Zealand we have, so we've just had The Ghost in the Shell, have been shooting, we've had Pete's Dragon. The Film Commission actually insists that the Indigenous people be honoured. So Disney, Warner, Fox, they have to have a traditional welcome. Everybody has to turn up, including Scarlett Johansson and her family, and they are traditionally welcomed onto a marae. We have a marae which is in our National Museum, and all the producers are there, and there's korero, so we speak to them and we explain to them about where the people from the regions, about who their iwi is. We have a thing in New Zealand where everybody is expected to know which is your mountain and which is your river. And so we talk about those things and how important land is to us. We consider ourselves to be the guardians of the land, the karakia. Nobody owns the land. So yeah, we've had Disney, Warner's, Fox, all those producers and the studio heads come out and they have to be involved in that. It's very important to us.
Next question. Just over here.
Bonjour. Wapske makwa dishnakaz, makwan dotem wajush onigam donjiba. In my language, I'm telling you who I am, where I come from. It's very important. For those who don't know me, I know some of these people here. I've done 4 features as an Anishinaabe filmmaker. And I was exchanging with Jesse because when I saw this, I actually changed my travel details to go on to Halifax later today because I wanted to take part in this. And one of the things that I have learned is something that I have come to call as spiritual sanction. And what that is essentially, as we said, we're getting permission to tell these stories. You know, I have gone into the lodge and I have sweated and I have prayed and I have asked, this is what I want to do. This is how I want to tell this story. These are our ancestors. Am I doing it right? Can you help me? Can you pray for the success? Now, one way to describe this is basically that, it's like the chain of title, right? In the white man's world, the Pakia's world, that's a chain of title. When I do my stories, I'm doing it our way. And that's something that as a more senior filmmaker in this country, I'm trying to pass on to the next generation. So I wanted to share that because this is a very important time. Jesse and Jason and others, we are engaging with senior government funders as we speak, trying to change how things are done. And it's been, I've been at this 20 years, and we're almost at the cusp where we are actually going to be able to have adequate resources, fiscal resources to tell our stories, which is something that hasn't really been touched on here on this panel, right? We've got so many projects in development, but there's never been the opportunity to really get into production because of some of the systems that are in place that don't allow us to get 100% financed or even 50% financed. And when you have an organization such as Telefilm, for example, which is the Department of Canadian Heritage, they're starting to listen, but if they're only coming in for 10%, 15% of the budget, and where's the rest going to come from? Here in Canada, we've got these very, very wealthy broadcasters, but they're not paying for content. And in fact, they believe that our stories are nowhere near as valuable as the stories that they're paying for, whether it's Hollywood, whether it's other mainstream Canadian filmmakers. So much so that, we're trying to devise ways to have our content be acceptable to the Canadian broadcasters, basically at a discount, so that at least we can trigger some of the funding processes that will allow us to get funded to 100%. So with that, I want to say miigwech.
Thank you, Jeremy. There's another question just in front. Yes, you. Right here.
And I'll say, Jeremy, I think we're going to get, I think we need all the major funders, the CBC in particular, those that are also on the content and exhibition distribution side. We do need all of them to set aside some historic differences and work together on this, because, reconciliation and cinema's involvement in it is bipartisan. It has to be bipartisan. It can't be voted out. It can't be something that's term limit, because that isn't going to work for our people. So we need to really get them all on the same page, and I think we're trying to do all that work. And one thing to follow up, I would also say on Jeremy is, in an industry that often seems starved for original ideas, it strikes me that for, 400 or so years on this land, we've been repressing an enormous number of incredible, rich stories, original IP, some might say. And although I would hate to ever say that, because I don't think that's how these stories list. But, it occurs to me there's all sorts of ghost stories and monster movies and thrillers and revenge films and all the stuff that people love to put on Netflix and everywhere else that, our people have been outlawed to tell each other for centuries. And, I would encourage everyone to go see Zach's movies tonight, because it's one of those stories. And I think, I would encourage funders to be a little, there's a lot of opportunity in these stories to make unbelievable movies that are going to go all over the world. And we can't, that are going to fit their paradigms if they had an open mind. And so I think that's the other thing we need to encourage them, is that, there is a richness here that has been forcibly buried for so long that it's going to come out, and if this is good, an opportunity for them as much as it is for us.
It is. We have time for one last question, just a couple minutes, right over here.
I'm a filmmaker, writer-producer who's been working on a project that's a Earth project, environmental project that deals with Indigenous. I'm from Santa Fe, New Mexico, dealing with the Pueblo people, and have worked very hard to include them in levels of the script. In the research I've done, taking the project to the elders on different levels, also here in Canada as well, even though I am not a First Nation. I actually don't know my entire heritage, but that's a question for the universe. But it just saying, and I think the reason that I'm speaking is because that in the endeavor of listening to you talk about the protocols, I've endeavored to try to create a protocol by getting consultants, by doing things and trying to approach it in a very humble, receptive way of getting feedback and trying not to, trying to find that dialogue. And it is a large endeavor. And so I'm just saying that, is there an open, because it sounded like in the beginning that you were very sort of, don't come to us with a story. We've worked very hard for years on a story that's multi-layered about the Earth. So it's a multi-tier question, just about the right approach in terms of this is how I've approached it, and as an outsider, and maybe that's the guide. That's the question.
How, as an outsider, what is the approach? If she's getting resistance or not a communication, what's the next step?
I haven't had resistance. I'm just saying that I'm trying to respect your protocol. What you're saying, it's very interesting. And maybe I'm trying to speak a little bit for other people who aren't Indigenous in the room, trying to do stories and tell stories in a very humble way that's inclusive and are horrified by many layers of what's happened. So That's sort of, what are the right, so.
Ian?
Yeah, definitely. So what you're saying is that you've worked on something for so many years, and then you've taken it to the First Nations people.
And that I want to be so this is the endeavor, that I want to be so respectful and gone to, it's a very fine line. I guess it's a concern of wanting to bring on the consultants, want to bring on the governors, wanting to bring on...
Okay, I want to get Ian to comment, just we don't have much time, so if you can just fill in.
This is exactly what I was saying before about, why do you want to tell those stories? What's your interest? Where, is there an agenda in that? Like I said, I don't want to go make a story about Ned Kelly, a bushranger in Australia. Got no interest, but... in Australia we have people saying, look, it's we want to capture the beauty of your culture. We want to do this. We want to do that. But if you're not talking to the right people in the first instance, then things aren't going to go well from the beginning. You've got to make sure that you have spoken to the right First Nations people who own these stories. Before you start going off, because you could be going off with the wrong tangent, and it sounds like you've ended up that way, and maybe it's just identifying that correct person, because I've had the same experience with our own mob in Australia. You can think that this is the actual people you're talking to, but you need to dig a bit deeper and consult with more people, and then you realise, okay, this person is just a bit of lip service person, but the real elders are over here in the quiet. They're sitting back.
But Ian as well too, I mean, there is a point where you also have to be open to the fact that you need to walk away or be open to the possibility that that's a necessity if the permissions aren't there.
Yeah, that's definitely right. You could have your heart set on something, but at the end of the day, if it's no means no, then that's it.
And inclusion really goes beyond just consultation.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll wrap up there with the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, the panelists, for everyone there. Thank you, TIFF. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake.